Hey guys, welcome to the Hybrid Athlete channel. I'm Dr. Paul Rimmer, and today's question comes from one of my athletes, Tasha, who's an amateur boxer, and her question is how do I balance having a social life with being an athlete? So I'm going to talk through my 5 top tips. Tip number 1, plan. We might have a competition calendar, but we should also have a social calendar as well. This helps in 2 ways. One, it allows us to understand where clashes are and then figure out which ones of those things we're going to prioritize. Obviously, depending on the level of athlete you are, whether you're more recreational or professional, is really going to determine how much focus you put on competition over socializing. But in all cases, if we've got a competition calendar and a social calendar, we can either then plan social occasions around competitions or figure out which competitions we can use that are going to then work with our social calendar depending on which end of the spectrum that we sit on. This also allows us to have things to look forward to, not just to get into that full-on athlete mentality where we feel like we're constantly training for the next thing, which is important for 2 reasons. One, because sometimes we might need a bit of a psychological break from training, and having some social time is important for that. And 2, we've also got to remember that as athletes, we quite often rely on other people regardless of level in terms of support structures. So it's really important that we make time for those people in our lives as well. So point number 2, now this one might sound a little bit silly. Write a contract to yourself. Now this is more for people who maybe get a little bit of excitement when they go out, they overindulge in food, they overindulge in alcohol, and it affects their performance. Quite often we get into these habitual patterns where we go into a specific situation and then we end up going through the whole, I'll just have one drink, and then it spirals out of control, for example. But if we can stop and write a contract with ourselves, the externalization of your internal understanding of why you should or shouldn't drink or limit drink or food or whatever that negative health behavior here is incredibly helpful. But it's actually incredibly effective when you can start to identify a reason to not do the most fun behavior. Like, some people like to go out and party, and that's absolutely fine. But if we just get our party head on, we need something to remind ourselves at a time where mentally we're in a more calmer, rational state, why we need to say, okay, we might go out and have party, or a party, but we also need to understand where the brakes need to be put on that as well. Remember, this isn't about restriction, saying I'm not going to do anything. This is something that I know isn't going to affect my training, isn't going to affect my weight. It's something that I still enjoy, but also I've now got a little mental checklist to limit the potential negative effects of going to excess. So excess is probably the word that I'm looking for there. Point number 3, strategy number 3, tip number 3, whatever you want to call it. Learn and understand the consequences of that negative behavior or the social aspects and how much impact that might have. So this can work in 1 or 2 ways, and this kind of leads on from the last point. Sometimes we might have one drink, for example, and we feel like, oh my God, I've ruined it, so then I go to an excess. It could be that I've had one bit of naughty food, and we've got such a negative association with certain foods that as soon as we have one bit of food, we've cheated on our diet, we feel guilty, and then we spiral out of control. Do you really understand the negative or positive outcomes from the behavior that you've just performed? So I think a lot of people socially end up making their social life imbalanced with their athletic performance because they catastrophize the little things they do, and then that spirals into an excess. Or on the other side of the spectrum, they're just so unaware and uneducated on the negative effects of alcohol on sleep, on recovery, and that sort of thing, that a little bit of education can actually go a hell of a long way to either stopping us catastrophize things if we're really obsessive about doing anything social and we get real social guilt, whatever that might look like, or on the other end of the spectrum, we're just like, we don't understand the consequences of the social behaviors that we're taking part in, particularly to excess, and therefore we've got no reason to stop those things, which kind of ties into the previous point in terms of understanding if we do struggle with excessive behaviors, what is it that we need to do or need to understand in order to really make that resonate with us to stop us doing that behavior. Balance the social element, because the social element is it's been completely taken off the table. Point number 4. Now, this is a difficult one. What I would say is, though, generally speaking, it's to stop restricting yourself during periods of competition entirely. Now, of course, you don't want to be drinking lots of alcohol if you're a competitive athlete or a high-level athlete. But if you're restricting certain elements of being social, if you're overly restricting certain elements of, food, like you're being like almost orthorexic, like you're eating clean all of the time, chances are that once we've then competed, that we're going to go back to a really negative behavior because we've been so restrictive that causes a pendulum swing back in the other direction, And then we get into this kind of like, we were an athlete and then we're a social athlete, and then we can't balance those two things, because then when we go to social occasions, because we do restrict ourselves, we become miserable. And then one of two things happens: either everyone knows we're miserable and then hates us for being an athlete, which then means we don't get the support that maybe we want, or it means that, and because we're in that mindset as well, we don't have a good time and we don't want that, and then we feel we miss out on social occasions. So then post-event competition year, we then end up going to an excess, and maybe that has an effect on our waistline or sleep or performance or whatever it be, when we should be recovering and developing in our off seasons or non-competition parts of the calendar. Or the other aspect of it is then we go and we're in this consistent restriction mode, and all of a sudden we have a little bit of something that we deem as being bad or something we shouldn't do socially, and all of a sudden, because of that, we then catastrophize it, and we then end up overindulging, and that point of restriction becomes such a thing that we're focused on that we then end up going to an excess, and then we have a little bit of something we deem we shouldn't have when potentially it would be fine, and then that means that we spiral out of control because we catastrophize it as well. So what I would say is, if you're trying to balance a social life with being an athlete, still take part in some social things, and don't be super restrictive unless it's definitely going to have a negative impact on your performance, okay? Which brings me on to point number 5. Point number 5, and this is a big one. Really try to think about where your beliefs and your beliefs and your behaviors come from with nutrition. Why is it that you believe that you can't balance a social life with being an athlete? What level of restriction is just a cultural thing within that sport, and what level of restriction is actually required to be successful in that sport? If you have a chocolate bar every single day, is that really going to make you a worse athlete? Or is it your perception of that which then becomes challenging? So a friend of mine, Hugh Gilmore, sports psychologist, means that quite often, talks about this a lot, where he says quite often, you've got facts and opinions on certain things. Sometimes we have to separate out what the facts and opinions are. And the opinions that we have around food or socializing means that even the sheer act of being present in a social setting makes us feel like we're failing and not being this dedicated athlete in some way. And therefore we become super restrictive. So if you really do have an issue with either overindulgence, like you're constantly going out, you can't restrain that, and therefore that's affecting you as an athlete, which obviously it might do if it's affecting sleep, alcohol, nutrition, things like that, then what we have to do is figure out and think what it is about that social element that is drawing us to it, and being able to question that. But on the other side of the spectrum, if we're being super restrictive all of the time and we don't feel like we can have any kind of social life, it's really important to question where those facts and opinions come from. Like, why is it that I have this opinion that I can't socialize? And like I say, on the other side of the equation, it's like, why is it that I believe that I need to socialize all the time? And between those two tipping points, we can find what is called our happy medium. Now, our happy medium is going to shift across the competition calendar. Yes, there's going to be times when you're deep into competition, or you've got serious events coming up, and maybe whatever level of athlete you are, you've trained really hard for something, where you're going to have to show some form of restraint. But that restraint doesn't need to be absolute restriction in most cases. But then what we don't want to do then is live at that end of the spectrum all of the time, so that social events become scary, and then when we do cut loose, boom, we're just off the reservation. Balance. Right, okay guys, it's been awesome. As always, take it easy, look after yourselves, peace.